Merhaba ya shabab. Hello there, folks. Kayaoğlu here. Well, nobody expected the Syrian opposition to win this one so quickly. Just a week after the fall of Aleppo, Syria's largest city before the civil war started in 2011, the rebels did a general pattern on Damascus, the country's capital, and just took it. In my previous video, I had discussed how and why Syria's civil war reignited on November 27th. At the time, I had projected that the cities of Hama and Homs, these are large cities between Aleppo and Damascus, probably would not fall so easily to the opposition. I was wrong, the rebels were right, and so here we are. Now, with the Assad regime gone, we got to discuss two fundamental questions. One, what should the various Syrian factions do to rebuild their country in such a way that they avoid the mistakes, the chaos, and the destruction that Iraq experienced after Saddam's fall in 2003 and Libya after Gaddafi in 2011? Number two, what should Syrians do to save themselves, to save their country, and to make sure that this sort of thing does not happen in the future? And that's really the main take-home line of this video. Only Syrians can save themselves and their country. The rest of us, we can only help them do so. All right, first let's look at the internal Syrian dynamics, the players, if you will. The most important faction here are, well, the anti-Assad rebels, primarily the HDS and the SNA, of which many of them are religious. A few of them are reformed jihadis and fewer unreformed jihadis. Then there are former Assad apparatchiks, if you will, who used to run the country for the toppled dynasty. Many of Syria's Alawites, who constitute about 15% of the population, are in this group, and it should be noted that the Assad family were also Alawites, though they are also joined by various members of the upper classes, of the middle classes, many of them who include among their ranks, Sunni Muslims and Christians. For example, the ousted Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad's wife, Asma, was from a Sunni Muslim family. And then there are smaller religious and ethnic minorities, the Turks, the Kurds, Christians, Druze, etc. Of course, among these Syrian factions, one could consider ISIS, also known as Daesh, but I'm not going to do that really. Mostly because the way that ISIS has been negotiated with, and this was the right way to negotiate with them, was through airstrikes, artillery barrages, ambushes, and skirmishes, as done by the Turkish military, the Russian military, the US military, and of course, the various Syrian factions that fought them at the height of Syria's civil war around 2015, 2016, 2017. Now, I know I'm being cute here, but there is a real risk that ISIS might reemerge if the fighting and chaos returns to Syria post-Assad. To avoid that, here's what I think Syrian players ought to do. Basically, two things, and fair warning, I'm the first to admit that I'm being cautiously optimistic here, and despite my best efforts, I'm being more optimistic than cautious. Now, this is obvious, but Syrians really ought to create a big tent political system without permanent winners or losers. One of the problems with post-World War I Syria, as well as Iraq, was that too many people were disenfranchised by sectarian politics, and all of that was worsened by incompetent governance. Whenever there was an election or a coup, and in Syria and Iraq, coups often took the place of free and fair elections, unfortunately. And if you were on the losing side, you, your family, your political party, your friends, your neighborhoods, your confession, you basically stayed that way for at least a generation or two, perhaps even more. And many supporters of that party and its leaders would get killed. But from here on out, if the Syrian political system is set up in such a way that if a party loses an election, but they still have a chance to contend in the next election freely and fairly, they won't need to take up arms. Syrians would be well advised to avoid the stupid sectarian identity politics stuff of the past and create a political system where they can all be roughly equally unhappy and dissatisfied in the short term, but in the long term, where roughly everyone is equally satisfied. That's really the trick. Of course, all that is easier said than done, so let's get to some of the specifics. The process of transitioning from an Assad hellhole into a free, prosperous, just, hopefully fair Syria down the road must come through an all-encompassing constitutional order with a good balance between the central government in Damascus and the various regions, the governorates of the country, as well as the different factions I mentioned earlier. The center can't be too powerful, nor can it be too weak. The regions can't be virtually independent, nor can they be completely under the authority of Damascus. Similarly, the majority Sunni Arabs can't take all the power and the resources forces for themselves, nor should there be specific reserved seats for various ethno-religious groups the way they've been set up in places like Lebanon and Iraq. Balance is the operative word here. To get a sense of how that system should be built or maybe not, and how it should be run, not run, maintained and not maintained, I highly recommend a book by one of my mentors, Professor Libby Thompson's Justice Interrupted: The Struggle for Constitutional Government in the Middle East. As a cautionary tale, Justice Interrupted discusses how time and again, especially Islamists, nationalists, and liberals failed to cooperate in various Middle Eastern countries in the last 150 years to form functional and representative polities. We Middle Easterners always like to blame outsiders for interfering in our affairs, but outsiders interfere in our affairs because we oftentimes stand weak. While Professor Thompson's book is not a political recipe book, a cookbook, if you will, it gives you a pretty good idea of what future leaders in Syria and different parts of the region ought to avoid. As Sarah Connor wrote in Terminator 2, death, destruction, civil war, conflict, that need not be our fate here in the Middle East. We can and should have a better destiny. The second thing that Syrians ought to do if they want to have a chance at having a good future is to disarm the militias, including and especially those that pose a threat to neighboring countries. And by that, yes, I do mean the US-backed YPG SDF, my country, Turkey's Bet Noir. Of course, I'm not just singling out SDF and YPG because I'm Turkish. I think that HTS, which spearheaded the toppling of Assad in the last 2 weeks, as well as the Turkish-backed SNA, should also disarm. Disbanding militias, of course, will take several years, but it should be done. One way to go about this, of course, could be some of the more professional battalions of the militias I mentioned could be integrated into the Syrian military, into the country's police forces. However, the broader point, only state authorities should be able to exercise the legitimate use of force. Because the broader point here is that if militias become a permanent fixture in Syrian politics, the country will go into a permanent state of a low-level instability, the way we've seen in Libya, in Iraq, in Lebanon. And Syria has one advantage that, for example, Iraq did not have in 2003, in that despite a lot of foreign intervention during the course of the civil war, the end result, Assad's fall, has been a Syrian-led affair, and that's actually very good. One of the dumbest things that the U.S. occupation forces did in 2003 was to completely dismantle Saddam's Ba'ath-led state. In 2003, the Americans fired not only the Republican Guard, the Mukhabarat, the intelligence services members, but basically anyone who was connected to the ruling Ba'ath party, even though one could only gain higher-level leadership positions by signing up for the party. Unlike, for example, after World War II, in Germany and Japan, U.S. occupation forces, except for higher-ranking criminals, basically allowed the mid-level folks, the higher-level folks, the ground-level folks working in different industries to continue running the country because they have the skills, the experience, the competence to run things. And I would consider Syria still pretty lucky in that regard. So really, Syrians don't need to repeat the mistakes that we saw in Iraq. Keep those who worked under Assad but did not violate anyone's life, liberty, dignity, let them be. Go after only those who committed crimes but focus on writing a good political rulebook, i.e. a constitution, and stick to it. Okay, so that's a very general summary of Syrian players and what they ought to do by a professor who hasn't been there in, 30 years? In my next video, I discuss the outside actors, starting with my native, Turkey, and then move on to the Gulf Arabs, Iran, Israel, and then the further distant players such as the Europeans, the Russians, and the United States. Of course, you're welcome to continue the conversation here on YouTube. If you have any thoughts or questions, write them in the comments below. And don't forget to click like and subscribe and turn on notifications and follow me on social media. I'm Kayaoğlu. Thanks for watching.